when all of a sudden his son just stops. His eyes roll back and they are completely black. This is exactly what happened to the Luarel family. In tonight's episode, we're going to dive into a classified case of a missing family surrounded in conspiracy and the supernatural. This story revolves around the Luarel family, name changed for obvious reasons. The Luarel family, back in the 1980s where the story takes place, had found a beautiful 3-2 home south of San Antonio by about 30 or so miles. The home was a gorgeous ranch-style home and had about 5 or so acres of land surrounding it. While the land surrounding it was more than adequate enough for farm life, horses, and livestock, the Luarels weren't really into having livestock, so for them, it was just extra land for them to get to enjoy. The Luarels were a small, average American, middle-class family. You had Dennis, the father, whom was a real estate broker at the time, and his wife Sheila, who ran an in-home bakery out of the house. Their kids were roughly high school, middle school age, about 12 and 14, his son being the oldest. While the immediate area around the house was around 5 acres, the area surrounding those 5 acres were a mixture of dense woods, open meadows, and rolling hills with ravines and hills that would go on for miles past that. This portion of land was pretty undeveloped and untamed, and there wasn't a whole lot of exploration. In fact, the entire area was just pretty rural and out in the countryside, which made it perfect for the Luarels to get away and relax in their new home. There were practically no neighbors nearby, and Dennis had scored the house for very, very cheap, unusually cheap, even for having the inside deals as a broker. He was skeptical at first. Having been built in the 1950s, he figured there might be foundational damage or there was something seriously wrong, but upon inspection before moving in, everything looked great. I mean, there was even hardly any cosmetic damage or things that needed to be reworked, so the family moved in almost immediately. After a few weeks of settling in, unpacking boxes, and just getting adjusted to a new way of life, the Luarel family was getting quite comfortable and used to their new life already. Until one afternoon, when they received a knock on the door, which they thought was strange considering there were no visible neighbors in the adjacent area. However, Sheila and Dennis both opened the door to be greeted by an older native man, who was very kind and polite, introduced himself as Luke, and asked if he can come in and have a cup of coffee or have some tea, and he would like to chat. Dennis and Sheila mainly just looked at each other, not really sure what to think of him being so forward with his request, but they figured why not. He seemed pretty harmless and was very kind, so they said absolutely, come on in, come sit down, we'll make you a cup of coffee, we'll sit and chit-chat. They figured maybe it was just a friendly old neighbor who didn't really know anybody or didn't have anybody to talk to. You know how old, lonely people get. After a few moments of small talk, they began to grow more and more confused about who this man is, considering he seems to know a lot about the Luarels family and their past. And Dennis is beginning to grow concerned when the conversation turns from just casual small talk to very blunt and serious. Listen, this house, this land that it's on, belongs to me and my people. I want you to do me a favor and either sell it to me or move out of it. Shocked by this stranger's bold request, Dennis politely informed Luke that he actually had purchased the property outright and even held the deed, and the deal was done at this point. I mean, they were in it and they were paying a mortgage on it. However, that answer was not good enough for Luke, as he informed Dennis that the house was somehow illegally built without his people's permission, and begins to tell him about the protectors that reside on the property and the adjacent land all around it, the 5 acres and the 30 acres respectively. And Luke warns Dennis and Sheila right there to their face, saying that if you don't want to sell the house or move out, that's fine, but know that these spirits will come in and try to take their land back. You don't have a choice in the matter. They're gonna do what they're gonna do. Dennis, growing all the more angry as Luke is explaining this, politely asks Luke to leave because he thinks he's either trying to scam them or do something. I mean, why would you have a stranger come to your house, act polite, and be very forward, tell you what he's already told them, and then end it with, hey, you need to leave your house because these spirits are gonna come and overtake your house? I mean, how would you even react to that? Dennis was going to have no part to play, so he tells Luke, you got to take a hike, get out now. Luke quietly and politely gets up from the table, nods at Dennis, steps out the door, but as he gets down the last step, he turns back and looks at Dennis right in the eyes and says, don't come calling me if they come for your family. Keeps the stare, turns back and walks off. Dennis is completely unsure of what to make of this strange visit or this strange man Luke. and does not want to be contacting him again. However, they look on the coffee table where Luke had been sitting, and he left his card. Weird that he would have his number on it, and at the title for his occupation, he put healer. Puzzled and confused and off-put by this strange encounter with this older man named Luke, he just takes his card, figures he must have forgot it, and just throws it in a drawer, completely forgetting about it. Why he didn't throw it away, we're not too sure. It's now been about 3 weeks since Luke's strange visit to the Laurels, and they have quickly forgotten all about it. In fact, they're busy unpacking and still getting adjusted to their new house, which they are loving. Sheila, Dennis's wife, her in-home bakery business seems to be exploding with all sorts of new clientele from around town. His son and daughter are also making new friends at school, and they genuinely seem to be more happy. So, on this night, Dennis figures he'd go outside on the porch and relax. Have a small glass of scotch on the rocks, have a cigarette, and just watch the sunset and get lost in thought. So he's out there, smoking away, and movement catches his eye, because he sees that off in the distance, way over that way, he sees a couple of figures coming out of the trees. The movement that he's seeing is clearly not an animal, but people. But he can't make out any discernible features or anything specific, but just notices that there's about 5, 6, or 7 of these people coming out of the woodline coming towards the house. Now he's watching these people, who just look like black blobs from where he's at, coming towards in the direction of his house. And immediately he feels like he's in danger because he doesn't know who these people are. Why is there more than one? What are they planning on doing, and why are they on my property? So, thinking that these people are up to no good, he goes inside, grabs his pistol, loads it up, comes back outside, and they're gone. So he looks around in either direction, where it's very open on this portion of the property, so there's really nowhere they could just turn and hide, not even in the brush, and they're just gone. Nowhere to be seen, nowhere to be found. Dennis thinks that's very odd, and after a few minutes he downs the rest of his scotch, puts his cigarette out, and decides, you know what, maybe work for me has just been too stressful. I'm gonna go inside and try to go to bed. The following nights after this, both his son and daughter began to experience severe night terrors. The son having horrific nightmares of dying and being killed out in the woods, while the daughter kept experiencing what she would describe as pins and needles going up and down her spine all night, like somebody dragging needles across her skin. And on one of these nights, the son, who's 14, wakes up in the middle of the night to this dark, tall figure standing at the foot of his bed. And as soon as the boy wakes up and looks at this thing and realizes, okay, this isn't dad, this is not my family, I don't know what this thing is, it reaches down and grabs hold of his neck and almost chokes him to the point of unconsciousness, and the boy is being choked by this thing, and he's screaming for help when it just suddenly vanishes. Just gone. And at this point, he is just full-on meltdown. He doesn't know what to think. He's only 14. He's never had an experience like this before. So he goes and tells his mom, Sheila, and his dad, and they don't know what to think about it because they're not really believers of the paranormal. They're hardly even churchgoers. They're just a regular agnostic family. And so they kind of just write it off and explain to him, honey, you probably just had a bad dream. Just try and go back to sleep. But he refused to sleep in his bedroom again after this, and actually slept on the floor of his parents' room for the next week or two until he can gain enough trust to go back into his room again. And even then, he would refuse to sleep at all with the light off. Following this specific event, the son and daughter, whose names were never mentioned for whatever reason, began to have these strange animal claw marks appear on their backs and their forearms at random points during the day and the night. What's very strange about these claw marks is they would come and go. It's not like an actual wound in the sense of where it happens and then your body slowly heals. It's that they would appear and reappear and appear and reappear in random intervals and random times throughout the day. It didn't really make sense. But the daughter specifically claimed that they really burned when you touched them, and they weren't sure what to make of what was going on in the house. Now, coupled with all of these things going on, which is just the experience Dennis had with Luke, the experience at this point that Dennis had outside, seeing what he described as people coming towards the house, but these people were just black shapes, and then the experience that his daughter and son had, and the experience that his son had by being almost choked out by this shadow figure, the entire family, Dennis and Sheila included, began to describe and feel a strange presence lingering inside the house and around the surrounding property of the house. A strange presence that made you feel uncomfortable and unwanted. Like the second you step out of your car, you just kind of have to look around because you just feel that something is not right and you shouldn't be here. It's this heaviness lingering in the air, and they could all feel it, and it soon became the elephant in the room where nobody wanted to talk about it, but you sure as heck knew that it was there. In this chain and series of bizarre events, their family dog, a German Shepherd whom they've had for about 5 years at this point, was found dead one morning. When Dennis got up for work, he went outside to go check on his dog and found him dead right inside his kennel. Upon checking on him, he was bleeding out the mouth, eyes, and anus. Worried and figured he had gotten into poison somehow, he checked all around, but there were no signs of poison anywhere. In fact, his son is the one that usually feeds the dog, and there had been no changes at all to his diet. He had not got into anything. There was no poison at all, like snail poison or rat poison anywhere on the property. So how their dog died? Complete mystery. And pretty soon, Dennis began to piece all of these strange things happening together and pointing it back at that strange elderly native man, Luke, beginning to get angry, thinking that, you know what, Luke is behind this whole thing. He's just trying to do all of this to drive my family out of here so he could selfishly take this house back. And he had gone to work this day, and the anger had just been building and stewing inside of him. And he's just been sitting there thinking about it more and more. And he's just thinking, you know what? When I get home, I'm going to call Luke. I'm going to pull out that card. I'm going to give him a call. And I'm going to give him a piece of my mind to let him know that my family is not leaving. He cannot drive us out. And he is not going to tell my family what to do. He is not going to hurt my family. He had already killed my dog. He had traumatized my son. This is all an elaborate scheme to get our family out. And he is done. So he gets home, immediately rips open the drawer, pulls out Luke's card, calls his number up. And surprisingly, Luke picks up almost immediately, and Dennis just goes off on Luke, telling him, I know it's you the one behind all these things. You're trying to drive my family out. I know you poisoned my dog. I know you set people to my property to try and scare me. I know you did some sort of prank to fool my son, telling him you're not going to fool me and I'm not going to move out of my property. And Luke simply just interrupts him and starts laughing mid-sentence with Dennis and completely cuts him off when he stops and just says, didn't I tell you what was going to happen? So Luke, completely unfazed by Dennis's angry outburst, just simply tells him, look, I'll tell you what, give me 3 days and I'll show up and we can have a nice little chit chat about taking that house off your hands and we can move forward and clear this whole thing. Dennis, still angry and now feeling mocked, just hangs up on Luke and feeling nothing but grief, anger, anxiety, and confusion over this whole ordeal between Luke and all the strange things that are going on and now the loss of their family dog. It's all too much for him right now, and he feels like he's just about to break under the pressure. The next day, he's sitting back on the porch after work, and it's just about dusk. So it's not quite sunset yet. The sun is starting to set in the sky, but it's not quite going down yet, so visibility is still very good. And he's outside again, drinking his scotch, smoking his cigarette, just trying to unwind from the day and the craziness that his career and life have brought him, when again he notices movement off to his right, out in the large area of the meadow, in the same spot where he saw the 5 or 6 figures from last time, except this time, the figures that he see were the same shapes as last, but they're going into the woods and not to his house. And immediately he's thinking, you know what, I've had enough. I'm going to follow them, and I'm going to find out what Luke told them and why they're here. Because at this point, he is convinced that Luke is orchestrating this whole spiel, and he is done. So he goes inside, he's angry, he's pissed, he's slamming stuff, he grabs his gun, he grabs his coat, he grabs his flashlight, and he's going to march off into that meadow, into the tree line, find this gang of goons, interrogate them, and find out why Luke had sent them and what their plans were. And he was going to have it end right then and there, call the police, and have Luke hopefully arrested if it worked out in Dennis's favor. He is convinced this is some big elaborate scheme or conspiracy to drive the Laurels completely away from the property so that Luke can take all of it back for whatever selfish reasons or gains that he is looking for. Dennis, who enters into the tree line, now begins to get confused because he's looking around and the woods aren't super thick, so he doesn't see any trace of anybody. So he figures, okay, well, maybe I'll just keep looking and walking and maybe I'll find these 5-6 guys. because there's not a lot of places you can hide, there's not a whole lot of brush, and the trees are loosely packed together. I mean, it's kind of like a meadow, but it is more packed in. It's looser woods, really. And he'd only seen them walking into this wood line no more than 5 minutes ago, and surely they could not have gone far. And so he's thinking, you know what? They're going further back, maybe to meet Luke, so I better go further back to see if I can find them. And so he marches further back. He's still really angry, and he's looking for them, but he doesn't want to make too much noise. He wants to surprise them and then bust them. After about a quarter mile in, maybe closer to a half a mile, he sees this huge mound of stones that are in this small clearing, and for what reason he described, he just felt compelled to come to it. Like it just had some sort of lure on him to draw him closer to this mound. And as he gets closer to this rock mound, which is kind of in a smaller clearing, he notices that the air around him begins to feel different, like the atmosphere changes. It's almost as if there's a thunderstorm coming, but there were no clouds in the sky. The air felt dense. It felt like static or electricity was filling the air. It felt ominous and dark and evil, like he shouldn't have been there. The mound itself had been created by somebody, and it looked completely out of place out here. Dennis was even more baffled by how he had never noticed this mound before, and he had gone out in these 30 acres of woods past the initial 5 since having this property and even before, and never remembered there ever being a mound here, so he's baffled by this. I mean, this is a pretty large mound. It's easily probably 15 feet in diameter and maybe at least 12 to 15 feet tall of just rubble, but the feeling that was surrounding this area was so thick, was so bad, you could cut it with a knife. I mean, the tension you could feel. And within moments of just being there, Dennis began to grow increasingly ill and got so ill in that spot that he began vomiting blood. He had never felt such an eerie, evil presence than in this very spot. After vomiting blood, he began to feel even worse, like death. And he knew, I need to return home now. I'm going to abandon my mission. Just forget after trying to chase Luke and his goons. I need to get home now and lay down because I am very sick. And he began vomiting more on the way back home. And he's only about maybe a quarter mile, half a mile from the wood line, and then maybe about another 5 or so hundred yards from the house. And by the time he actually makes it back to the house, he is feeling far worse, continuously vomiting up blood, and tells his wife Sheila something is really wrong. I need you to take me to the hospital now. And so Sheila, overtaken by anxiety and fear for her husband, takes her husband to the hospital. So they get to the hospital and they do all the usual tests. They stick him with an IV, they do a blood draw, they check his levels. But after doing all these tests for a few hours, Dennis turns out to be completely fine. In fact, on paper, his health is great. He's hydrated, there's nothing wrong with him. His heart pressure is great, his heart rate is great. He doesn't seem to be under any signs of stress, but from a physical or aesthetic point of view, he's clearly very ill, continually vomiting up blood and shaking and feeling very sick, going in and out of consciousness sometimes. It was so bad. And looking at his vitals and his blood, everything checks out on paper, and so doctors are baffled by his symptoms, and they don't understand that why everything looks good on paper, but he is clearly very sick. So they decide to keep him overnight, make sure he's okay, and make sure nothing gets worse. And he does make enough progress overnight that by around midnight, they actually decide to release him and say, all right, you know what, you're good enough to go home. You're not having the severe symptoms you had when you arrived, so we're going to tell you you're okay. And so he goes home, he tries to get a good night of sleep, but even that following day, he still feels not quite right. Not as bad as puking up blood the day before, but on the verge of bedridden that he's so ill. Dennis goes throughout the remainder of the day sick as a dog, not puking anymore fortunately, but just feeling like the flu times 10. And by about the evening time, he's lying there on the couch, just feeling awful when there's a knock on the door. And so Sheila and Dennis look at each other, confused and totally having forgotten all about the whole Luke conversation a few days before, telling Dennis and them that he would show up 3 days from now. Sheila, confused, goes and opens the door, and sure enough, it's their favorite person, Luke, who kindly just greets her, tips his hat off, and just inserts himself into the house and saying, how are you guys doing? He stops almost mid-step, looks at Dennis right in the eyes, and his happy, upbeat expression turns cold and serious, and looks at him so strongly in the eyes and says, You should have never gone back there." Dennis, completely baffled and shaken by his tone and the seriousness in his voice, doesn't even know how to respond. Instead, Dennis goes on the same old tripe again, how this is all Luke's fault, and that this is Luke's plan to somehow poison the dog, poison him, get rid of his family, yada yada yada. You've been hearing the same spiel the entire episode. And Luke cuts Dennis off and just chuckles at him and explains to him, "Look, you can make these accusations all you want, but I'm going to restate what I already told you the first time we spoke. The spirits are getting angry and they are growing very impatient. You don't have a lot of time left. You got to make a decision now. They will not stop coming for you. Either your family is going to die or you're going to leave. One of those things is going to happen first. You need to decide which." But Dennis is as stubborn as a mule and refuses to hear any of it and thinks at this point, "I am about done with Luke's nonsense." He tells him off, tells him to go leave now or he's going to call the police. And Luke is just baffled by this. Luke does not understand why Dennis is just so obstinate and not taking into consideration anything Luke has to say. So his tone goes back to serious. He just nods in understanding, steps out the door, looks back at Sheila, nods, looks back at Dennis, nods, and just says, "I'm sorry it had to be this way," and walks off, and he's gone. And as soon as Luke had left the property, things take a very dark twist for the Laurel family. Dennis has had enough. Sheila is unsure what to make of all this, but she's very bothered. She's a pretty quiet person, so she's not really outspoken about her opinions and beliefs. That night, once everybody had gone to bed, Dennis, who was sound asleep, woke up to Sheila, his wife, screaming bloody murder, and so he jumps up out of bed, looks at Sheila, who's looking out their bedroom window outside. He's still feeling very under the weather, so he kind of hobbles over to the window to see what she's screaming bloody murder at, and what he sees terrifies him. He sees those same people, what he saw a couple days previously going into the woodline, and originally coming out of the woodline. About 10 or 15 of these people, there's no features, these are just human silhouettes that are black, just slowly approaching the house, step by step by step, taking their time, walking from the direction of the woodline as before, but this time they are much closer to the house. And with Sheila still screaming, Dennis goes into action mode. He is panicked, but he realizes, you know what, I gotta go grab my pistol and I gotta protect my family. So he gets his pants on quickly and he runs over to his liquor cabinet, rips it open, pulls out his gun, loads it, runs back to the window, and they're getting closer and they're getting closer. And he hears this violent, horrible screaming coming from his son's room. Completely panicked, he gets up and he runs down the hall to his son's room, opens the door, and his son is there on the bed, shaking and having seizures, and his eyes are rolling in the back of his head and he's screaming. And so he drops his gun, runs over to his son, picks him up, and he's looking at his son who's just shaking violently and having seizures, is what he described, with foam coming out of his mouth and just his eyes rolling in the back of his head. And he's screaming at his son, "Son!" And he's screaming at his son, making sure his son is still here, when all of a sudden his son just stops. His eyes roll back and they are completely black. And his face had completely changed from his son's to something else. And immediately, the son just starts laughing and telling him in a voice that was not his son to let them in. Let them in. It's time, let them in. Dennis stumbles back in fear, runs out of his bedroom, and hears his daughter now screaming. I don't think this is something that I would have personally done being in Dennis's situation, but I guess I have to try and put myself in his shoes and realize that under his mind frame at the time, in this very moment, he was probably under a very tremendous amount of stress and a very tumultuous situation. I can't even imagine how you'd even react or feel in a situation like this. My only assumption is that he is not thinking clearly, so he runs to his daughter's room, but she's nowhere to be found. She's gone, even though he had just heard her screaming. And so he's thinking, I gotta go find my wife. We gotta get out of here. So he runs back downstairs and he opens the door to his wife, and she is unconscious on the floor. And keep in mind, these figures have not stopped. These people or things or whatever they are continuing to get closer and closer and closer to the house, ever so slowly. And so Dennis runs over to his wife, picks her up off the floor, and she's out cold. She is out cold. Luckily, she's still breathing. I mean, she's alive, but she's just completely unresponsive. Dennis has no idea what to even do at this point, what is going on. This is all far beyond his realm of comprehension and understanding. He gets up, runs over to the hallway, grabs his gun off the hallway floor, runs out to the porch, and starts firing shots off at all of these things, screaming, "Leave my family alone, leave them alone, I've had enough." But the bullets aren't doing anything. They're just passing right through these shadows, so to speak. The very last thing we know about this night is that these beings or entities get inside the house. Police Officer Fitzgerald, name changed for the sake of the story, had arrived at the Luarel residence in the early morning hours at 9:09 a.m. after receiving a disturbing 911 call of a woman screaming in the background for about 5 seconds and then cut out to static. This alerted 911, obviously, is a very dangerous situation. They had sent 3 officers to the scene, figuring this could either be a dangerous, violent situation, a potential hostage situation. So they had sent Officer Fitzgerald, Officer Harrison, and Officer Gagliotti to arrive on the scene. What the police found would greatly disturb all 3 officers, whom they couldn't make sense of anything they found. Upon arriving at the scene, the first thing they noticed was, due to the call and the nature of the call, and the condition the house was in, the family car was left completely intact. Nothing wrong with it, it was still there. Nobody had left the property at all. However, all the first-story windows surrounding the house were completely shattered, and shattered from the outside in, meaning someone or something broke every window to get in the house. All 3 officers began to call out outside and into the house where the police were here. If there's anybody here, let us know. Call out, but they heard nothing. And as soon as they got into the house, the front door was open. They noticed, all 3 of them by the way, noted how cold the house was, and outside it was warmer, considering this was in the summertime, and just how icy cold the house was despite having any air conditioning. So cold you could see your breath. The house was a disaster. Furniture flipped over, windows shattered. It looked like a bar fight had gone on and exploded inside the house. But there were no blood trails or any obvious signs of a murder or anything that they would suspect as foul play. It just looked like somebody had broken in. After calling out and looking all around the house, they found nobody. They didn't see anybody. However, towards the back section of the house, sitting right by the basement door, was Dennis. Almost completely naked, covered head to toe in blood, sitting there curled up in the fetal position on the floor, shaking and rocking himself, muttering gibberish. When they had found him, they tried to talk to him, but he was completely unresponsive and would not even make eye contact. They even shined a light in his eye and tried to get him to respond, but he was gone. He was mentally gone. So they handcuffed him, they detained him, they took him in. There was tests done on the blood on his body, which did not turn out to be his wife, his daughter, or his son. They could not find out whose blood it was, and it was not his either. They began trying to question him and find out, where's your family? Where did they go? Why are they gone? Where did they go to? But Dennis was so mentally gone, he could not even comprehend English in questions, so he had to go into psych care in the hospital. After some time, he came to enough, he was still very mentally unstable, but he came to enough to, in depth, tell the officers and detectives exactly what had transpired from the very beginning of moving in to the events that we had just gotten to right at this point in the story. And the last thing he claimed that he remembered was shooting at these people and then falling unconscious or blacking out. That's the last thing he remembers. The 2 detectives who were working on this case were completely in denial of what he had to say and did not believe his story at all. And they believed that Dennis had murdered the family, did something with their bodies, and he was behind all of this, that he had staged some large, elaborate, supernatural story to try and get off murder. And judging by how mentally unstable he was, even though looking at his past history, he showed no signs of mental illness, they were convinced that he was a closet schizophrenic and somehow he had just got lost in the throes of a bad schizo episode and went off and murdered his entire family in an anger tangent. These 2 detectives were convinced they were going to find out the keys they needed to put Dennis away for life and prove he murdered the entire family and the dog, but as it turns out, within days of interrogating Dennis, both detectives were let go from the force, and in the days following that, both would disappear. Dennis, very shortly after this, was taken from the hospital by an unknown man to an unknown location, and that was the last there was ever any sign of Dennis, and his current whereabouts are completely unknown. The elderly native man, Luke, who had just said that he lived right down the road, And because Luke never existed on paper and did not match any descriptions or any location to where Dennis had pointed them to, they were convinced that Dennis had made up this character Luke in his schizophrenic mind as an incentive to murder his entire family, and was another part of the reason they were going to find the keys to lock him away for good and prove that he did indeed murder his dog and his entire family. But after they got let go and they too disappeared, it made the case all the more mysterious. And then just shortly thereafter, an unknown individual coming into the hospital, releasing and somehow having the authority to release Dennis and taking him to an unknown location is very strange, where we have no idea who Dennis is or where he is today. The Luarel family and just about every single piece of documentation surrounding the entire case, the 2 detectives, the officers that worked on the case, and the entire family has either been destroyed or deeply classified, all in some large attempt or conspiracy to hide the truth. For what reason, I personally don't know, but I believe that because this case had supernatural qualities to it, it might be why. Obtaining this information, I was told by my intel, was extremely difficult and took a lot of digging, and that there are hundreds of other families who've experienced something very similar, just as this, and their voices will never be heard, unfortunately, because for whatever reason, the government and law enforcement has decided to permanently silence them. While this story is entertaining, it also serves as a remembrance and respect to the Luarel family. So, I grew up being exposed to Bigfoot, although it took years until I realized what I was actually dealing with. My family is very aware that they live on my father's property. My sister, who also lives in the country, thought she too had a Bigfoot, because they would always hear children giggling outside. But there's nobody there. When I visit her home, I live in Canada, she lives in Ohio, I always feel uncomfortable, and I'm able to sense that there is indeed something there. I've never really mentioned it because I didn't want to scare her, my nephew. I knew something was looking in the windows at me at night, but I thought it was their Bigfoot, despite it feeling different. Well, now I'm convinced we are not dealing with Bigfoot. Recently, my sister has been hearing things outside, like clicking, stuff to get her attention when she is smoking on the steps to her house. She thought a coyote had approached her in the night, but she said something wasn't right about it. All she could see were the eyes. She only hoped it was a coyote. 2 days ago, she said that something was whistling at her, and she was scared. Then, last night, she called me, panicked, saying she had heard kittens meowing in distress. She is a cat lover, after all. To me, it's trying to lure my sister out, and it knows she loves cats. She said that none of her animals would go outside with her last night. Her dog is attached to her hip, so the fact that he did not want to go out there was a red flag. At first, I thought it was a Wendigo, so I began doing research. Obviously, my understanding of what those were was wrong. So now I'm here, looking for advice on how to get rid of whatever this is, be it a Skinwalker or a Fleshgate. I knew there was something wrong with that land. To give a little backstory, in my teens, I live in a small town in Oregon, and on property surrounded by a forest that's really not that dense. I have a few neighbors that are not close, but still within yelling distance. Last night, I was told to go close the gate. It's about 150 feet away from my house. I don't like going outside at night. And people at our house, not just my family, have occasionally heard someone calling to them, trying to lure them into the dark areas of our property and out of view of our 4 cameras. They only cover the area around the entrances, which I have had happen to me once. I asked my mom if I can ask my dad to go with me to shut the gate. She said yes. Then she got mad at my dad for agreeing, even though she said I could ask him. She called me immature ended up running really fast to close the gate. On to the actual story. I decided to talk to my friend about how my mom got mad about my dad, willing to go out with me to shut the gate. The conversation drifted to why I don't like to go outside and tell him about the 4 encounters, including mine, about something mimicking somebody's voice, luring them into the darkness. He does not believe in things like that, and I go to sleep, wake up like normal, and I get to talking about what I was telling my friends to my older sister, and how we needed more cameras, since they aren't capturing this thing. Can you guess what she tells me? Last night, while my mother was smoking, she heard my older sister calling to her from the darkest part of our property and the biggest blind spot of our 4 cameras, all trying to lure her away into the darkness. Also, this has happened to my older sister twice, along with hearing heavy footsteps on the roof at nighttime. She doesn't like going out at night anymore. Not any more than I do. Now, she knows why I don't like going outside at night. I'm not just being immature. I think it might be a skinwalker, but someone with more knowledge, please shed some light about what kind of creature this could be. My dad has night vision binoculars that can take pictures and record video, but sadly, no audio. I'm hoping these will come in handy. I'm going to ask my parents if they're willing to add at least 1 more camera in the blind spot, since that small area is where 3 out of the 5 events happened. As I noticed, it likes to stay away from our night vision cameras. I also asked my mother about it. She said that it happens a lot. She goes out in the middle of the night to smoke, and that huge light illuminates most of it, sometimes when she goes out. This is not normal. It shouldn't do that. The bulb was well over 15 years old when we replaced it a couple of months ago. Can skinwalkers shut off lights? I never knew that it happened at all, since I have never seen it, though I check the cameras frequently. My people are very different from the Navajo and Algonquin. I won't say we are similar, other than the big category we are thrown into. However, there's one thing that crosses from them to me. I'm not sure what exactly it is. I'm not going to ask you, but I'm going to share my experience. I'm a Seminole native from Florida. I was raised among one of the biggest res we have there. It is, however, very overgrown. It gives off a ghost town vibe. I lived by a bunch of people, so I wasn't very afraid of what goes bump in the night. I was probably around 15 when this happened. At this age, I was isolative, and only came out of my room when I called. That was it. Maybe I'd get food every now and then, but it wasn't often. So, I was sitting in my room, watching TV, and I heard my mom say, "Tay Gooch." That's my nickname. It means little girl. So I got up, and I walked out. Asked what she needed. She got confused and irritated. Told me she did not call me. Made me go back into my room. This happened a bunch, ranging from my real name to my nickname. There was this time that I had sat with my mom and remember her telling me to grab a Diet Coke. I thought it was weird, because I had just gotten her one a minute ago. But I got up and got it regardless. Handed it to her. She was confused. I also was confused, and we started arguing. She took it, but I began to question my mental health. That was until she heard it too. I remember, we were sleeping on the floor together and having a rare family night. My sister and I already fell asleep, but my mom was up. I don't know what happened. I woke up to her screaming for something to leave. "Go! Get out of here! Leave us alone!" I asked what had happened, but since she was already made, she told me to go back to sleep. I later found out that she had heard footsteps in the hallway, which scares the everlasting life out of me. I know this could be grouped with some other thing, like skinwalkers or wendigos, but according to lore, wendigos will call to you in the voice of people you love, and I believe someone was testing the waters. I used to work on Vandenberg in Central California. My office was on top of the mountain that was ceremonial Chumash land. Whenever ground was broken, we had to have a religious leader come out and bless the ground first. It's usually pretty foggy, about halfway up the mountain. I got used to driving it every day, but you have to keep an eye out for deer, mountain lions, bears, all sorts of wildlife. One night, around 11 p.m., I was driving down the mountain, had just gotten to the point that the fog was gone. In front of me, in the clear, behind was just a wall of fog. As I got to a sharp turn, I saw what I thought was a large coyote in the road. I quickly slammed on my brakes. It looked like it had no fur, and was covered in pale, leathery skin, with a dog-like head. As I looked at it, it rose up on its hind legs. It was hunched over, maybe 6 feet tall, but maybe 7 feet tall, standing straight up. It turned and looked at me, slowly walked off the road, into the brush. At the time, I was doing a class about Native Americans for my degree. I was in touch with Chumash members for my project, so I asked them if they knew anything about it. They simply said, "We don't talk about that." This day, I'm 100% certain I saw a skinwalker that night. What do you do if a skinwalker has seen you? I was traveling in the dark at work tonight, and I'm on a military base in a gated area where it's pitch black, except a single light post near the gate. I need to go outside to smoke. A wolf-like creature that was pitch black walked directly under the light, so I could see it fully. I thought, cool, looks like a fox because of its thick black tail. Then I realized it was around the size of a wolf, with really thin legs, a lot of hair hanging down its neck, and its tail was dragging about a foot behind it. It stopped and turned its head slowly towards me. All I saw was its shiny white eyes staring through me. I couldn't move until it looked away, and did a 180, went back into the shadows to where I could not see it. I slowly approached to go out of the gate. It had disappeared after I got outside. The gate locked. I lit my cigarette, started smoking, decided to turn on my phone's flashlight, scan the fence line where it had gone. The area it disappeared into was a lot shorter than I originally thought. The gate I went out only had about 20 feet before another gate cut the area off. The creature had disappeared, so while I was scanning slowly, I saw nothing. But I did hear a whistle that sounded like it had come from not far up directly in front of me through the gate. I slowly backed up, got into my car. Was it a skinwalker? What does the whistling mean? Last I checked, there's no dog I know that's full black with long dragging tails that whistle in the middle of the flight line on a military base. If anybody knows anything, please let me know. My grandfather was not a good man around this time of his story. He was really what you would call a disappointment. My mother even tells me, back when he was in his prime, he was hanging out at the Rez's skate park with some friends, and just overall, having the time of his life. They were drinking and trying new things, just teens being teens. It's said that they saw a figure walking in the woods. They began to harass and yell, thinking it was a person. It gets fuzzy here, but he said that it began to chase them, maybe 500 feet where they ended up behind the school in a little shed, closed the door, and hid. I guess it saw them and ended up knocking around the shed and wouldn't leave. He and his friends hid from whatever it was till morning. Prior to when I was born, my mom was in a similar mental situation as my grandfather. This one is shorter. The story goes, my mother and aunt were hanging out in an empty house, drinking, and doing other things that teens do. Chillin'. And then they hear a very loud cackle, like laugh. They stopped everything and waited to see if somebody would come out. My aunt, being who she is, laughed, and once again it started up. My mother had freaked out and begged her to stop. Just then, a beer bottle flew past my aunt's head, busted in the back wall. I don't recall what she did after, but I'm assuming they ran. When my uncle was around 2 or 3, he had gone missing for a few hours, and they ended up finding him where the res meets the forest. They asked him what happened, and he just said, I was playing with the little people. The little people are a legend of a lot of tribes, but have represented differently. My people portray them as tricksters, who also sometimes mean bad luck, or even death. Again, these stories are passed down to me by my elders and mom. My writing isn't the best. I still ain't got the point of posting. However, I hope you were able to understand at least some of this. Thank you. So, as a preface to this story, I was driving on the State Road 54, a road in Florida that goes all throughout the state, and for the most part, used to be all woods. It was 3:45 a.m., and I was driving to my friend's house, who lives just 45 minutes away, to carpool to our job in a city about an hour and a half away from where he lived. I was leaving the city that I lived in and was driving through more heavily wooded areas at a red light. As I was waiting for the light to turn green, I saw the glow of 2 bright orange eyes. The woods were approximately 25 feet from the main road. The eyes got closer, like it hadn't seen me, and it looked around 6 to 7 feet tall. Thin, quite thin. It was too dark to see any features, but when our eyes connected, the thing bolted into the woods. It just didn't look human, frankly, and at this point, I thought it might be a bear or something, as it was standing on its 2 back legs. And I mean, that son of a gun was quick for its size. I have no idea what I saw, but the profile seems to look like a Skinwalker or a Wendigo. I have no idea. Any possible help or info to explain what I saw would greatly be appreciated. This story is from my mother, her friend, and her friend's daughter. They also experienced this. I was asleep at the time. My family has a caravan, or trailer, for those in the USA, that we go and stay in for the holidays. It's up in the Victorian high country, here in Australia. It's pretty remote, with some small towns and farms. One night, at 3 a.m., my mother had gone out to the communal bathroom block. Her friend and friend's daughter were also awake. While mother was in the bathrooms, she heard what she described to me as the most horrible inhuman growl, scream, echoing all throughout the valley. It was nothing that she had ever heard before. Not any of the common animal sounds she had heard there either, like deer calls, possums, bulls from nearby farms. She said that she was terrified. My mother's friend and her daughter had heard it too. They thought my mother was going to be murdered or something. Even our dog was barking. Mother came back safe, and they all spoke about how they had heard it. Somehow I slept through it all. I was only 11 at the time. I've always been curious. I want to know what it sounds like, and what it was, although my mother tells me to this day that I should not want to know. Whenever I'm there, awake at night, it's quiet, I listen. I've been told that my situation might be a skinwalker. I don't know if that is true, so I'm here where others know more than I do. I don't know if this has any bearing on anything, but my ancestry is Native American and Irish, with a touch of Scottish. My father was Native, his father Cherokee, and mother Mattapony. My mother was a Lynch from the Lynch clan, with a Scottish ancestor back in there too. I will try and make this short, and can fill in anything if somebody wants more information. This pretty much started in the 2000s, with some weird events. We had all kinds of, paranormal things happen. Typical experiences like objects moving, etc. It was me and my 3 children. Then, I picked up a stalker who would come to the house, dressed in all black. He would be wearing a black motorcycle helmet, would be looking in windows day or night. Sometimes he drove a black vehicle, still wore his helmet. No plates on either. My neighbor chased him off a few times, and if I saw him by the time I could get outside, he would usually be driving away. I came home a few times to weird things like every bowl or spoon in the house missing, all appliances on and plugged in, but all doors and windows closed and locked. Police did not believe me. At the same time, we were experiencing a lot of paranormal activity. Disembodied voices, seeing people walk across the room, doors opening and closing, cabinets, shower curtain being jerked open when the shower, and nothing there. We did not tell the police about those events. Then, one night, my girls, about 10 and 12 at the time, woke me up screaming that there was a man at the window. I went to the room. The blind was down, and I thought they had a nightmare because of what was going on. I pulled the blind up, and there was a man standing there. I did not get a good look, but he had to be very tall to look in the window, so I dropped the blind and called the police. We went downstairs to the family room and waited. There was a door in the converted basement, and the knob kept jiggling, like somebody trying to get in. We sat in horror for 3 hours before the police finally showed up. Outside, the girls' window, they found a blue piece of construction paper with a circle and 3 smaller ovals created out of a cornmeal-like paste. They figured it meant that me and 3 children. They did not believe me about any of it because it just snowed and there were no footprints. Not long after this, I became ill and was later on diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, fibromyalgia, and myofascial pain syndrome. The harassment continued as well, and all the paranormal activity. I don't know what else to call it. Fast forward a few years, my children grew up and moved away, and I remarried. Moved about 5 minutes away. In the beginning, not much happened. I actually felt great, physically and mentally. And then it all started again. We saw people sneaking around, windows and doors, weird things occurring on the inside of the house, paranormal type things. We have seen orbs come in one bedroom while we lay there awake, pause, and go out the other window. And during all of this, my health went downhill again. This is over the last 8 years. What is the weirdest is a few times a year we hear a howl, almost like a wolf right outside. I lived in the Montana wilderness for a short while when I was in my early 20s. I have had plenty of wolf encounters. It sounds similar to a wolf, but it is louder, longer, not as guttural, I think. It is always right in the middle of the night, no specific time. It has happened at 8 p.m. as well, and woke us up. Definitely not a dog. Our dogs and cats freak out as well as the neighborhood dogs when it happens too. Then, the smell the next day is like a skunk outside but earthier. Not as rancid, if that makes sense. But it is not a pleasant smell at all. So, I just wanted to stop and have a nice, comfortable, normal life as much as that possible. Someone said this might be a skinwalker. I personally have not done anything that I know of, but maybe my parents did. I say this because my mother once told me a story after I was born. They moved down to Mississippi, where my dad was from, a very small town. The house they were to rent was not ready, so they were allowed to stay in the schoolhouse. This was a very rural area. My uncle, Dad's brother, was with them, and he was going to stay with them. I don't know if it was the first night or what, but one night, they awoke to the chanting of "Bring us the baby." They looked out, saw white figures moving in and out of view, all chanting they wanted the baby. My uncle thought it was the KKK, because they were native, and went out and told them to leave and shot at them. He kept shooting, but hit nothing, and told my mother they had no legs that he could see. He went back in, and they barricaded the door. This was long before cell phones, so they couldn't call anybody, and there was no phone in the school. They sat there, backs against, over desks, as it went on until daybreak. My uncle left then, and did not hear from him for 3 years. My dad would tell me he's not going to talk about it, and if you asked my uncle, he would leave. My mother only spoke of it one time, and refused after that. I'm not saying I'm special in any way, shape, or form, but could all this be connected? Can a deal be made and then I and my children go through this because it was not completed? I'm tired. I am to the point to where I look at my husband and say, "Oh look, the comb is moving across the sink by itself again." Just stupid things. I'm working from home now, and it is non-stop wearing on me. We just heard the howl recently, and had the smell after that. We lost our refrigerator, garage door opener, dryer, and my laptop. To give a better idea of how things are, back in the beginning of November, I was reading on my Kindle on the couch. My husband was at his desk behind the couch area. My desk was in front of me to the left of the fireplace. It was about 8:30 at night. A white weasel ran up the left side of my desk, ran across my desk, a big old metal tanker desk, and jumped down the right side by the fireplace, and just disappeared. My dog on my lap saw it, and a Siamese and Maine Coon saw it, all went over to investigate. They were all fluffed up, looked really disturbed, and checked out the desk area for about an hour. The dog hid initially after checking it out. He's not very brave. I was told the white weasel was a bad sign, but really gave no more thought to it. But a week later, my father passed away. He was in good health, so it was sudden and a shock. We have cameras inside and out, and the great room cam froze when this happened. I rarely get things because the cameras want to freeze up and have to be restarted. I do have one night where we caught orbs doing weird things in the same room, recorded on a motion-activated camera. Anyway, I'm sorry for this being so long. I don't know if any of this is related. All I can say at this point is I'm beyond frustrated. The summer between junior year of high school and senior year, I had a lot of firsts, including my own account with what I believe to be a skinwalker. After talking to my grandmother, who's half-blooded Navajo, she believes that we've had something following our family ever since we left the res. I never had any experiences myself, not until that summer, where this thing would start appearing almost everywhere I go. It first happened when I was walking back from the store one evening, visiting a friend's house. I had gotten some candy and a pop, and was walking home, just minding my own business, listening, jamming out to Spotify, when I saw this strange tall coyote figure off in the distance on the hillside. I didn't really think much of it, and kind of just shrugged it off as maybe I'm seeing things in the evening light. But I looked again, and this figure, which appeared to look like a tall coyote, walking on two legs, coming toward me, but at a diagonal angle. This only caused me to walk faster. Now I was a little freaked out, and I did not know exactly if this was a person in a costume or what I was going to be dealing with. As I picked up my pace, whatever this person or thing was also picked up their pace. And before you know it, this thing was within 30 feet of me. So I stopped, looked directly at it, in hopes to make it stop. I know that sounds incredibly cheesy, but at 17 years of age, I had no idea what else to do. I knew running would probably only make it chase me even more. And it stopped, looked at me, and it was right at that point that I could see into its eyes. They were very dark, but the irises and the pupil were almost like a glowing ambery orange, very evil looking. The face looked very sunken down, very dark, and not in a color dark way, like there was something wrong with it. And for whatever reason, I believed that what I was looking at was completely from the demonic realm. It was kind of like half man, half coyote, except the head was entirely coyote, but the body and the legs were more man-like than anything else. I kind of just quickly looked down, paused my Spotify, and slowly backed away as this thing stood still and never took its eyes off me. I backpedaled and backpedaled until I could turn around and think to myself, I'm going to make a run for it and take a chance. If this thing follows me, I'm hoping I can outrun it. So I backpedaled some more, with this thing still staring me down, eyes on me like a dagger. And in one fluid motion, I turned around and sprinted faster than a high school track runner, all the way down the block, down a second block, down the next block, never looking back, and never hearing this thing following me. Once I'd made it several blocks, right to where near the store where I bought my candy and pop. I looked back, didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. I felt like I was safe, for the time being. So I walked home the long way, which took an extra 40 minutes from where I was at. Once I got home, I felt really uneasy the rest of the night. Like my entire night was just ruined. I was in a foul mood. Not just obvious distress, but something had disrupted me, emotionally, internally. I feel it was this point that I felt like I was marked. A couple of days go by, and I just get the feeling that maybe it's a good idea that I speak to my grandmother and tell her about what I had encountered a few days before. I knew how she was. She's what I would call very superstitious, even though she still believes in a lot of the native lore, and her beliefs very much so come from that area. I was still very worried that I would be met with conflict and a lot of doubt, but surprisingly, I just said, you know what, screw it. So I called her up, told her what had happened, and she asked that I come over immediately so she could bless me. While she wasn't anything special, like a medicine lady, she was good friends with one of the local medicine men from the res, who actually traveled over 300 miles to come to us to bless me. Well, I think that's great. We still had sightings and encounters the rest of that summer. One time, about a month later, I was spending time with my grandmother's house. At nighttime, we were outside, smoking cigarettes, joking around. This is in Southern California, far away from the reservation. I didn't think I had anything to worry about, but I was very wrong. And at the time, I didn't think anything of the lore or any of the beliefs of the Navajo. In fact, one of my good friends was actually a mix of Choctaw and Cherokee, and he thinks the entire thing is all baloney. Doesn't believe any of it. He's pretty much rooted in modern-day culture, though. So, the only roots to his native culture are his blood. I pretty much sided with him before all of this happened. But once I started having my encounters, I kind of switched to the other direction as far as my beliefs go. Having first-hand accounts with something will definitely change the way you think and feel about anything in particular. So, anyway, we're out there, smoking cigarettes, joking around, and the sun's pretty much setting really low in the sky. We kind of just get lost in telling each other stories and talking about fun memories we have together. And before you know it, it's pretty much almost pitch dark out. My grandmother's inside, and she's probably wanting to know when my friend is going to leave, so she can spend time with me. At one point or another, him or I were mid-sentence when we both felt this distinct change in the air and atmosphere around us. It was so noticeable that as soon as it happened, I felt the change on both of our faces, like our expressions had changed from normal to now, what's going on? We both instantly began looking around us, expecting somebody to be near. But it was so dark now that we couldn't see anything, and we did not have any flashlights, only our phones, and the flashlight app on our phone isn't all that bright. I mean, you could only see maybe 5 or 7 feet in front of you. Whatever we felt wasn't good. We quickly wrapped up our conversation, threw our cigarettes down, and walked back into the house. Very quickly, he's like, "Hey man, I think I'm going to take off." And so, I didn't argue with him. I just wished him well on his way. So he heads out, and I start talking to my grandma. And maybe 30 seconds goes by, and I immediately remember I needed to borrow $20 from him. So I run outside, and remember, it's pretty dark out now, and I call to him, and I hear him call back to me. So I run up to him, and I'm like, "Hey man, I forgot to ask you from earlier, could I borrow that $20? And instantly, I feel this force come at both of us. It made us both jump, and we both take off running. The only way I know how to explain it is that it felt like something very evil coming right for us, and our bodies just reacted to the emotion and took off running in the same direction. We both ran and ran until we got to a couple streets down, where him and I are panting, not knowing exactly what was pursuing us. I knew right then and there, it's exactly what I saw a month ago, the same creature. So I tell him, forget trying to run away. Let's run in a big loop around the neighborhood and circle our way back to my grandmother's house, because I'm sure at this point, she's probably wondering why I have not come back inside. So we do that, and it takes us about 12 minutes, being very stealthy, very careful, but we could still feel a change, a very distinctive change in the atmosphere. It's incredibly creepy. We make our way back to the house, praying that this thing did not follow us. We get inside, and my grandmother immediately notices both our faces are pale white, and we look scared out of our minds. She knows, and immediately calls her friend, the medicine man, and says that she knows what happened. We need to be blessed immediately. Yeah, that summer was a wild one, and since then, I try not to mess around too much with things I don't know too much about. There were other small incidents here and there, but those were the main two that were actually worth writing about. And the fact that the second time, I feel like whatever this thing was, assuming it is a skinwalker, wanted to attack me, potentially kill me. Why it had targeted me and my family, I'm not too sure. I also don't know too much about my family's history on my mother's side, which is my grandmother, who's half Navajo, and her side, which, if you keep going up the family tree, is all full-blooded Navajo. Maybe the family on her side did something, and this thing has been tracking us down ever since. This is all just guessing, of course, because I really don't know, and I have not asked my grandmother. But, even as I write this, maybe it's time I do. I'm scared writing this. We were checking on an escaped rooster in the woods that has backed our house. We took a very shanty flashlight, spotted him quite easily. Something about these woods just aren't right. They feel off, and I had a terrifying encounter with something in them that to this day is both unexplained and witnessed by the police, my neighbor, and my girlfriend. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, we were walking back after successfully locating our escaped rooster, perched in the distance on a tree branch, just beyond the woodline. This is when we both noticed a gray mist-like thing in the sky, almost like an owl. The problem is, we both witnessed it vanish into thin air. We went inside for a moment to check on our daughter, and when we went back out to figure out what that was, we found nothing, or so we thought. The house next door built a shed with a motion detection light in their front lawn. We were standing in our front lawn, looking into the trees with a better flashlight, expecting to see an owl. Instead of the motion light kicks on, and we see a dog. Sorta. It was something on 4 legs, and it ran into the distance, only looking back a few times. Problem with this is the dog would have had to have been standing still for at least 10 minutes to not re-trigger the motion light, as it stays on after being activated for 10 minutes. It's like the dog appeared out of thin air, in front of the motion light. The strangest part, that it appeared right where we say the misty air creature disappears. What are your thoughts? I'm terrified. Could this be a skinwalker, a shapeshifter, or something else completely unnatural? This happened to me in the mid-1990s. I was stationed at Camp Pendleton, California, and had duty one evening. Part of the duty shift is to go around and check that certain doors and buildings were securely locked. At about 3 in the morning, I was out doing my rounds, and I saw what I thought was a big coyote in the road. Seeing a coyote in that area would be unusual, but not impossible. As I was watching it, and it watching me, it stood up on hind legs, walked out of sight between a couple of buildings. At this point, I was alarmed, but I figured I was hallucinating, since I'd been awake for something like 24 hours. Wouldn't be the first time my tired eyes and brain had played tricks on me. Later on that morning, one of my fellow Marines, I'll call him H, asked me how my duty was. One thing to understand is that the Marines seem to have a relatively large number of Native Americans. May have something to do with the pride of code talkers from World War II. And I've had one friend, H, say he joined the Marines because he could not find a warrior job anywhere else. We were infantrymen. At any rate, H was Navajo. I had known him for years, even spent a couple of weekends at his family's place near Gallup. I told him about my hallucination. He got quiet and said, I'll call him B, another Marine in my company, also Navajo, but I did not know him nearly as well as I knew H. He's a bad guy. I'd stay away from him. Now, it's always been difficult to tell if H was joking. He was a man of very few words and fewer jokes, but he seemed very serious. I told him to quit messing with me. He responded by telling me that B was a skinwalker. I had never heard that term. That came from a family of skinwalkers, and that they were like bad witch doctors. At that point, I didn't know what to believe, so I dropped it. I can say that every time I came across B after that point, he just stared at me. I gave him a wide berth from then on. He had some other odd experiences in the American Southwest Desert, as well as what was probably a jinn, and when I was embedded with Iraqi troops years later, we could see a man walking around in the darkness, but nothing with thermal or IR sights. But that was by far the strangest, and the only time I ever came in contact with anything remotely skinwalker related. This isn't necessarily my own skinwalker experience, as it is more of a general story surrounding my family and their background. My mother is full Navajo, just like her mother before her, and her father, So, my great-grandfather apparently was what I'm told was a skinwalker. He died a pretty horrific death, probably in turn from his own black magic, or so I'm told. Now, even though he was supposedly a skinwalker, his daughter, my mother, and I are not anything like that. We do not dabble in magic, and only entertain good spirits. My mother and grandmother both have pretty terrible stories about this man. He was very wicked, very abusive, and very mean. It doesn't sound like he became a skinwalker until later on in life. But even when my grandmother was a little girl, he was just awful to her. And as my grandmother grew up and got into her later teens, her uncle, who she was very close with, somehow went missing and never showed up. She firmly believes that her own father murdered him in some sort of blood-pact ritual to inherit the powers of a skinwalker, because after that, her father turned incredibly dark, and sometime when my grandmother was in her early 30s, her father, aka my great-grandfather, passed away, and at that stage in her life, she was pretty detached from her own dad. He had stopped coming around, became even more evil and abusive than ever before, verbally and emotionally too. She had 3 kids at this point, one of them being my mother, and even her own children feared her father, even after he passed away. That was just the beginning. My grandmother claims that after he died, that was just the start of things. All of a sudden, this dark energy or dark spirits began following her family around, which she believes to be the spirits that possessed her own father, and once he passed, not having a body to control, they are now free to roam and come after her and her family, frequently attacking them in any way they can. My mother was witness to this multiple times growing up, seeing all sorts of horrible things happen. One of the most frightening was one night when my mother was about 10 years old. They were staying alone, just her and her mom. Her siblings, she believes, were off at a friend's house this night, when all of a sudden, these walking upright coyote-looking creatures began trying to break into her single trailer, doing everything they could to try and tear the door down. They were very aggressive and evil-looking. She remembers them very clearly, trying to look into the window, like they were searching for a weak point, trying to scare her, and they had glowing red eyes, something that was incredibly evil. After her and her own mother, or my grandmother, began praying, they pretty soon left. But that was just one of the many times that they endured this. Eventually, my mother grew up and moved away off the res, where my grandmother still lives, and still has these attacks every so often. They've definitely died down, and they don't happen near as much. She prays a lot, and she also has a medicine man frequently come out and bless her house and property. But after my mom moving away, down to Southern California, she doesn't now deal with that near as much. When she had me, and I grew up, I actually moved up north to New York State, and safe to say, I don't deal with any of that, thankfully. I call my mom every week, and we talk about it, sometimes. She hasn't had any experiences, not since leaving the res, and many times we'll do a 3-way FaceTime call with my grandmother. She's usually in pretty good spirits, doing pretty well for herself. We only talk about what happens sometimes. She's still doing okay though, not having anything too strong. But when she was younger, the attacks sure were frightening as they were frequent. I'm sorry this wasn't my own personal skinwalker experience, or maybe it just wasn't that exciting. But I figured the information was unique as it is interesting, and I thought you'd like to hear it, so I shared it with you. You're more than welcome to tell this on your channel. If anybody could offer me advice, like maybe what to do, maybe what to tell my mom or grandmother, and maybe give me some knowledge on if it's true that when my great-grandfather died, the spirits that possessed him and controlled him now still try and haunt my grandmother. But then I also wonder, why have they not attempted to come after me or my mom now that we've moved away? I'm sure there's some reason for this. So, I'm 21 now, and recently, after work, I was telling one of my coworkers about an encounter that I had in high school with some supernatural being. She seems to think it was either a skinwalker or a fae, and was even legitimately surprised that I'm still alive after it. But I don't know. Was wondering if any of you could help me out. So, for context, when I was about 16 or 17, I was hanging out with my group of friends at a friend's house near the Indian Reservation in Washington. This was around Colville. But our friend had an orchard right behind her house. So, naturally, we decided that we would play sardines, that hide-and-seek game where one person hides. When you find them, you hide with them, out in the orchard at night. So we had been playing for like 2 hours at this point, and I had found myself lost by myself in this orchard at like 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning. So I'm wandering around in the dark in an orchard, trying to find my way back to her house, when I noticed at the end of the row, I was standing in there was this super tall, probably 8 to 9 foot man-shaped thing, made of orange light, just standing there. So naturally, I thought it was an old street lamp, and the branches just made it look like a man. But I had to test my theory. I walked about 8 to 9 rows in one direction, looked down the row, and that thing was standing at the end of that row too. So I began walking back and forth, picking random numbers, and every time it was standing at the end of the row, probably like 300 to 500 feet away from me, it never got any closer. Until finally, I had proven to myself that it was not crazy, and decided that if it was going to kill me, it would. And simply, I wouldn't know how to defend myself. So no use worrying about it. I walked away, found my way back to my friend's house. When I told my coworker about the other night, she was genuinely surprised that I was still alive. Told me that to her knowledge, the only two things it could have been was a skinwalker or a fae. But everything I can find on the internet about skinwalkers says they usually present themselves as a deer or a coyote. I can't find anything on what a fae is. Apparently, the reason she was surprised that I didn't die was because a skinwalker usually will kill indiscriminately, because that's all it's looking to do. Apparently, if this was a fae, I had tried to offer it something it might not have killed me, but since I didn't, it definitely would have. Also, I know that rude Raksha seeds can ward off negative energies and entities. It makes me wonder if that was a fae or a skinwalker. Did my mala protect me? I will preface this by saying I'm not trying to categorize what this person saw as a skinwalker. I think this is a useful category, but at times broad. I will only describe what he saw. When he and I and a few other students discussed what he saw, skinwalkers came up by name. So did Wendigo. We loosely referred to it as a skinwalker, but mostly just as it. I'm a high school teacher. I love my job. I teach math, which I love and the kids hate. So, to keep to the kids on my side, I frequently give them breaks to just do whatever. So, by now, my students know I love talking about certain topics, including the paranormal, but especially UFOs. We actually listened to the Hunt for the Skinwalker audiobook yesterday in the class that this student is in. So today, this student, a super smart and talented kid, I might add, charming, witty, a great young person, says to me, "Hey, I have a story." He was driving to his home from the gym at about 9:30 p.m. someday last week. He said he was feeling great, had a great pump, everything. He was turning onto his street when he saw a bipedal thing moving quickly in the direction of the road he was able to turn onto. It was in an open field. Said it was the color of my classroom wall, basically white. But when I said it was white, he would say no, say it was the color of the wall. He said it was tall and slender, but not just skin and bones, still muscled. He said it was moving at a speed similar with his car across this field, and said its legs were long and it had big feet. I'm struggling to exactly recall or honestly make sense of how he described its legs and locomotion. I'm going to ask for clarification, but it also seemed like he was struggling to describe it in the first place. He mentioned its knees being prominent, but also that it seemed to have that weird classic dog leg thing going on, but only when its legs was back. He says when the leg was forward, it bent like a human leg. I'm kind of imagining it taking these fast tiptoe-looking steps, where its legs come down and back, maybe changes shape or something. He said its arms were long, and it had witch fingers. He did not see a head or neck on its shoulders. We looked at that classic 4chan Skinwalker trap cam picture, where it's looking at the camera. He said, that's what I saw, but without a head. He said it left a tall, blurry trail of its own image as it moved. And the oddest thing of all, he said, it turned into a street sign. So I asked for clarification on this, but he was confused as I was. He watched it cross the street and blend into an existing street sign and disappear via this transformation. I've suggested he could return to the location of the sighting and see what he can find or remember. I find his report credible, and that he believes himself. I know a whole bunch more about stuff in the sky than I do on the ground, so I figured bringing this to light was important. Let me know what you think, especially if this rings similar to other encounters. I don't know if what I saw this night was a skinwalker, but it freaked me out pretty bad. So I'm getting off work pretty late. I'm a cook at a restaurant that I won't mention. I don't want any people driving around here, or for me to lose my job, since I still work there, or worse, for this place that I love to get bad publicity. I'm kind of family members with the owner, so we'll just keep it at that. I'm leaving for my car one night, and across the field from where the parking lot is, I see this really large coyote. I thought it was weird because usually you don't see a lot of farm life out here. Maybe a cow or two, since we're surrounded by large pastures and we are kind of out in the sticks. But we do get a lot of traffic since we're near a large highway. Again, I don't want to give away too much. So I'm walking towards my car, and for whatever reason the size of this thing just catches my eye, and I look at it, and it's maybe 50 to 70 feet away from me, just standing there, on four legs like you would expect from a normal coyote, but it's just staring at me, and I thought that was weird. So I shrug my shoulders, walk to my car, unlock it, and I get in, and I just feel compelled to go look at it again. So I turn, and as soon as I turn my head to look at this coyote staring back at me, it does something I can't even comprehend any animal could ever possibly do. Just like a person would, crouching down. It very casually just stands up on its back legs, very comfortable looking, like it wasn't struggling at all, and didn't even seem like it was even hard. It appeared so natural and fluid. And as soon as it stood up, it began just walking towards me, so naturally just like a person would, and it had this smirk on its face, like it was going to do something bad. So I started panicking, going as fast as I could to turn my car on, throw it in reverse, and as soon as I began reversing, out of the parking lot, this thing now picks up its pace to full speed, and is now sprinting toward my car. As it's closing in on me, I put it in drive, and I floor it out of that parking lot, onto the main road. Luckily, since this was around 11 p.m. at night, there wasn't a lot of traffic, so I didn't have to worry about yielding or watching for other cars. But man, as soon as I got out of the parking lot, I didn't see it anymore. So on the way home, I immediately phoned my boss, asked him if he's ever seen any strange animals in the restaurant before, or outside, I should say. He says no, wanting to know what's going on, if he should be concerned. And I told him I just saw a really large, aggressive coyote. He should be careful. He was still at the building, and so he went and checked outside but didn't see anything. I haven't seen it or anything like it since it happened. This was back in October of last year. and I've been going there consecutively every night, since it's my job. I don't know if it will return, or what it could be. I told another family member about my experience, after being very hesitant to open up. He told me, or they told me, that it sounds like it could be a skinwalker, but I don't know anything about that stuff, so I posted it online and got minimal feedback. Somebody pointed out that I should reach out to you, and that you might have the answers I need. So I wanted to know your opinion on this situation. Was this a freak creature, or did I actually encounter a skinwalker? Maybe a Wendigo? I would love for any opinions, thoughts, and advice you could offer. Thanks.